Welcome back to the Firestone Files. I am Dr. Chris Firestone, and today we're going to continue on talking about Charlie Kirk, the contemporary Christian Socrates. That's coming at you today on the Firestone Files. Well, welcome back, everybody. It's been quite an amazing week. I did that podcast as a special one offer, I thought, a historic moment, but this continues to be historic times. And so today I want to offer another kind of tribute piece to Charlie Kirk. When this podcast drops, it will be a day after the memorial to Charlie Kirk in Phoenix at State Farm Stadium. I'll be going to that event along with many other Turning Point staff, and of course, thousands upon thousands of other people who want to pay their respects to Charlie. From what I can tell, with the little bit of inside information that I have, is that that stadium holds up to 70,000, and they have more than 250,000 registered. So not sure how that's going to happen. So this guy, his person and work have been shown to be a social, a cultural, an academic, a political watershed moment in the West here. Charlie often talked about saving Western civilization. I always thought it was a little bit tongue-in-cheek. That is a huge ask. But ever since I did my op-ed with Marlon de Blasio on the Bible Belt being the last stand of the Western intellectual tradition and its relationship to the Christian faith, I have come to believe that he really did believe that his work with Turning Point, his work on campuses around the country, was able to be the catalyst for saving Western civilization. I mean, this sounds like an audacious claim on one level, but this guy actually backed it up. He backed it up with his actions by continuing to go into universities and to stake claims and to promote open rational discourse. But he did so while building one of the largest organizations and youth organizations ever seen on this planet. And that's a huge accomplishment. And I have just a very small role to play in that with Turning Point Education. And I was praying with the guys tonight at our mentor sort of small group. And I talked about Turning Point Education in general and Turning Point Prep Year in specific as being the point of the spear of the movement that Charlie was really all about. It's the newest thing that Turning Point was doing. It's the only thing that hasn't really shut down for a couple of weeks after his assassination, because education can't stop. We got students and we've got to move forward. So we are doing just that. And it's really on the strength of Erica and Charlie, and Charlie's legacy and Erica's strength that we're able to keep going. That's what he would want us to do. His ministry to universities impacted me. I wouldn't be working here. I wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't for Charlie, his success, his message, and his person. He gave us a kind of methodology that I have grown to greatly respect. It was one that I was struggling to put together for years. But this guy, 18-year-old all the way to a 31-year-old, just went out and did it. And I have been doing some thinking about it. I think it's basically a fourfold strategy. Penetrate the university context. Speak to young people, not to the professors. Oh, he would often invite the professors forward too. But the young people are voters. The young people are citizens. The young people will determine the fate of this country and ultimately the fate of Western civilization. So he took it upon himself to engage them. Zero in on the foundations. Don't get caught up in all sorts of other philosophical and theological argumentation. Although he was well versed in many of these arguments, focus on the Bible. Focus on the moments in the Western intellectual tradition that are noble, true, and good, and the founding documents of our country. Those are the three things. I've talked about these in the last podcast, but I think they're worth mentioning again. They're the centerpiece, really, of Turning Point Education Prep Year. And I think they're the watershed in Charlie's own vision for what students absolutely had to have to be upstanding American biblical citizens. And the fourth thing, I think, in Charlie's methodology was debate the antagonist. Come to the microphone. Say what you have to say. Allow me to respond. Allow me to ask questions. And see if your worldview, your vision, your view of humanity, your anthropology, as it were, stands up to close scrutiny. And I think time and again, he showed the emperor has no clothes on. And that many of the students coming out of our universities simply are ill-equipped with the basics in life. And so Charlie, he was transparent. He showed us that. He showed us that much. That the value propositions of contemporary universities are low. They put you into debt. They teach you a lot of bad ideas. You don't know the basics of who you are in history. And they really are doing a disservice that we're paying a heavy price for, both as a culture and as individuals who go to the universities. And that brought up to all of us here at Turning Point Education, really, Turning Point Prep Year. Last week we discussed Greek thought, and basically in that week I'm studying the Sophists with the students. We're reading those texts. We're reading, for example, Gorgias, Euthyphro, some of other of Plato's writings. And so we're looking at the Sophists. We're looking at Socrates. We're looking at Plato. We're looking at Aristotle this week, and all in the original writings, not in the Greek, but in English. You know, there's only so much you can do in a one-year program. But we're getting a sense for those foundational elements of the Bible and the Western intellectual tradition that Charlie thought was so valuable to understanding who we are in the 21st century here in America. It dawned on me that in the process of grieving over the loss of Charlie, but also studying the life of Socrates through the eyes of Plato, that Socrates and Charlie had an awful lot in common. They possess many of the same qualities. And so, there's plenty of, differences. Socrates lived about 300 years before Christ, so he certainly wasn't a Christian. But some of the early church leaders, theologians, fathers of the church saw the likes of Socrates and some of the Greeks as thinkers that were kind of kindred spirits. And so this relationship between Athens and Jerusalem has been historically of interest to Christians, theologians, and the church. People like Tertullian famously said that rhetorically asked, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? But most Christians weren't like Tertullian in that sense. They knew that there was a kind of faith and reason relationship between the two. And that whole notion of the church expanding so rapidly to the West and into Europe is directly related to the fact that the Greco-Roman tradition had paved the way both physically with pavement, but also intellectually with sound reasoning, given their limited nature. They didn't have revelation, but they had the mind, and they utilized it with lots of critical rigor and in ways that paved the way for Christian ministry to thrive eventually. And we see that, of course, in the Bible with Paul. He goes out west, the famous, engagement there in Athens on Mars Hill with the unknown God and so forth. All of that's made possible because of Greco-Roman philosophy. Now, it had kind of, in a sense, seen its heyday by then, but it was still culturally well understood, well defined, and created a fine pathway for Christian advancement. And so Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, it seems that they were kindred spirits in sort of tangible philosophical ways as well. Socrates' arguments through the mouthpiece, or through the writings of Plato, for the existence of the soul, the possibility of an afterlife, the importance of virtue, and the pursuit of justice. They were kind of emerging theists. They'd come out of a polytheistic culture, but there's lots of the echoes of just plain theism that are emerging there. So we have this fertile soil for monotheism, for a God they didn't fully understand, that would ultimately be fleshed out by the Christian worldview. All of these things make him a kind of kindred spirit to Christian thought before Christ. Now, one difference that's important to mention here is that the university was not yet born. And so Socrates isn't going into any universities as a sort of Socratic gadfly asking questions and so forth, because Plato, of course, establishes the academy, which used to be the name of Turning Point. We moved away from the Turning Point Academy, made it Turning Point Education. And I don't know if the leaders of Turning Point knew how philosophically sound that would be, because I think that Aristotle's Lyceum is probably a little closer to how Charlie parsed out his Socratic inclinations rather than the academy. I guess we could have called ourselves Turning Point Lyceum in that sense. That was a word actually Charlie used on the phone call with me. He said, "Are you talking about a kind of lyceum?" And I go, yeah, I guess I am. I hadn't thought of it that way, but Charlie had. He'd already thought about the implications of that. And as we moved away from Turning Point Academy to Turning Point Prep Year, it sort of has dawned on me the significance of that statement. So that's the classes that we're working on, and how there's some parallels between what I was thinking about with Socrates and what I'm now seeing afresh in Charlie's work over the last 13 years. The context is interesting. Socrates his context was intellectually diverse. It was loaded with sophists. Now, I've already mentioned that we're going to talk a little bit about sophism. And sophism is, sophistry is typically thought of as a negative. And in fact, that's how I'm going to talk about it as well. In class, we've already been talking about some of the sophist writings. I've mentioned Gorgias already. Gorgias was a self-described orator. And the essay Gorgias is a fairly lengthy one. We're only reading about a third of it because it's so lengthy, but we're reading the first part where Gorgias and Socrates are in dialogue with one another. And the essay is really about the Socratic method and how he uses it to figure out what Gorgias means by being an orator and what that job of oration, which is really kind of like public speaking, contributes to human flourishing and to knowledge. Gorgias seems to think that it's the highest end of human beings to be orators, because oration, we discover, is not really a positive contribution to knowledge per se, but requires a kind of person of virtue. And Gorgias admits as much through Socrates' sort of questioning that oration itself can be used for good or for evil. And it kind of requires a virtue or a person of virtue who is exercising it. So he catches Gorgias in a contradiction. At first, Gorgias said that oration is a good in itself and it leads to a pursuit of the best. But after questioning from Socrates, he gets Gorgias to see or to admit that although it does have inherent kind of instrumental value, it does require a person of virtue to wield it in order for it to help human beings flourish or to pursue the good life. So that's an interesting outcome. And I mention this here because the Sophists in general provide the intellectual backdrop, kind of a negative or dark intellectual backdrop, because they're the negative influencers in society, even though they think they have their hand on the pulse of truth. As long as they can convince other people that their position is right and persuade them to do what they want them to do their bidding, the Sophists believe that oration, the power of public speaking, saying what needs to be said to get your way, is the way to have a successful life. And they were paid for it. So notoriously in the ancient Greece, these Sophists would take money. Socrates wouldn't take money for his wisdom. He would just ask questions and be a kind of gadfly to show really the Sophists don't have that much going for them. In fact, they are, the verdict is still out, I think Socrates wants to say, on whether or not they have any real contribution to make toward human flourishing. So Gorgias sees the power of oration as persuasion without knowledge. And Socrates really tries to pick this apart. Is a person with knowledge more persuasive than the person without knowledge? And although Gorgias gives some ground on that, saying, well, if a person is knowledgeable, they're sort of persuasive just by matter of fact, but the power of oration can overcome even the person of knowledge. And so it's kind of like this super skill that somebody might be able to have. And Socrates is a little bit uncomfortable with this because Gorgias seems to naively believe that the power of oration is naturally pointed toward the good. But once he is questioned by Socrates, we find out that no, it really could be evil as well. And so that's one of the Sophists. Now, we spent a lot of time this past week talking about Gorgias in class, and now, we're moving on to other aspects of Plato's writings and to Aristotle. But there are other Sophists, not just Gorgias. He's one that I mentioned. There's Protagoras. Man is the measure of all things. So he is the Sophist who is kind of the relativist, subjectivist, that thinks that human agency has the power over truth. And so they're sort of cousins. One thinks the act of persuasion is in Gorgias was also famous for laughter. By creating a humorous environment, he could get people to do what he wants them to do. Protagoras was much more of a rigorous thinker, and he argued that man is the measure of all things, and he was a relativist in that sense. There's other Sophists that emerged in Plato's Republic, for example. In Book 1, there's Thrasymachus in this whole discussion of justice, and Thrasymachus is way ahead of his time here because he argues that power is what establishes the just. In other words, might makes right. If you go fast forward to Michel Foucault in the 20th century, Michel Foucault said things like history is written by the winners, and that there isn't necessarily truth, there's only power plays to be made. And so you can see that these Sophists have something in common with our contemporary political discourse. For example, we have the act of persuasion. We have the act that truth is determined by human beings through subjectivity, that man is the measure of things. And we have power dynamics that must lie behind those things. If you have those three things, you can, like you're like Archimedes, like you can move the world. They create a kind of fulcrum point where you can move the entire world, thinks the Sophists. And so by the time we get to Socrates' apology, where he's in the Athenian court with over 500 senators and he's on trial for some trumped up charges, he's dealing with a majority of Sophists. And he's having to argue for truth, beauty, and goodness in his own veracity of his disposition and his actions in the face of people who simply want to see him die. So that brings me to this comparison I want to make between Socrates and Charlie. I was just doing some brainstorming after teaching here at Preta. There are some remarkable sort of conceptual and sort of interpersonal similarities between the two. Socrates' life was cut short by a Senate that was packed with Sophists. And it kind of mirrors modern America, where Charlie, his life was cut short by a bullet to the neck in a political climate that was packed with Sophists. How many times have we seen speech for persuasion, but not knowledge? How many times have we seen people waffling back and forth on concepts because they want to tickle the ears of the audience rather than be in the truth? How many times have we seen laughter over deep dialogue? This is all we find with Gorgias, one of the Sophists, back in the ancient Greek world. But we see it in our political culture as well. How about humanism that denies prayer and God in public spaces? That man is the measure of things. Such people are using nominalism and logic in kind of a warped alliance to get their own ends, to make the world look like the way they want it to look rather than how it actually looks. My buddy Nathan Jacobs makes a lot in his Nathan Jacobs podcast about the distinction between nominalism and realism. I think he's spot on this, that the nominalists think that the world has no inherent structures and that we can just name it and claim it and make it what it is for ourselves. That has horrible results. It doesn't really make a lot of sense, but it is a way in which to try to get your way in society and the power dynamics that come from it. Rather, Nathan Jacobs talks about being a realist. That is, a person who recognizes there are inherent structures. When you kick against the goads of those inherent structures, you create problems for yourself, for your family, for your society, and for your nation. And so we see that in the Sophists. They're nominalists. They don't think that there's deeper truths, there's deeper goods, there's deeper beauties, and so forth. It's a scary, scary development that we're seeing there. And so I'm concerned, like a lot of other people these days, about the sort of polarized environment that we have here in America and also in the West. But I'm concerned mainly that the deepest, darkest problem are with the Sophists and the supermen, and I put that in scare quotes, at the far left. So what are these, I think that's enough on sort of that contextual similarities. What are some of the similarities, really, of what Charlie's methodology was all about? The Socratic method seems to be one of those similarities. There's dialogue that needs to be had in our universities that gets beyond the mainstream position that's being sold by the universities, because we know that has been corrupted to some degree, but also the dogma that we have in our own position. We want to be lifelong learners. I think that was something that in conversations with Charlie that I've had, that he was all for, that we need to be and to represent the very things that we're trying to promote. So he did these sort of prove me wrong, challenging, the faith, culture, politics in real time. Let's see what you really think, unfiltered. And really, this captured the imagination of young people. There's a guy who's willing to talk to us about any topic at any time with a perspective that has force, and that you'd better do your homework and then come fully loaded, as it were, with arguments and positions and a reasonable, perspectives, or he'll show that your position is not worth much. The search for truth, goodness, and beauty, I think that's a kind of sort of standard trope, really, in Greek thought, and Socrates in particular. Socrates cares for the soul, and to the extent that you're true, beautiful, and good, in pursuing, virtue as your highest ideal, then you are growing as a human being. And that's really caring for your soul. If you go a different direction towards vice, it's the destruction of the soul. I think Socrates understood this. Charlie, kind of in a Socratic fashion, understood that God and God's word, are the ultimate anchors for truth, beauty, and goodness. And so any time that somebody claimed that they were in the truth and they had a position, he put up the measuring stick. Sometimes he called it the owner's manual, the Bible, to see whether or not what they were saying was true or good or beautiful. And if it was off-center or warped in some way, he'd call them out on it. And he'd ask them to make a case for why it's better than the biblical position. Socrates was all about exposing ignorance. Now, he didn't expose ignorance for ignorance sake. He didn't try to demean people. He tried to show them that their supposedly sophisticated understanding of an issue was really more like a teenager's understanding or a fifth grader's understanding. Charlie exposed sort of leftist propaganda and the sort of elitist brainwashing that's happening in our universities, and showed that students were not getting their money's worth. And that's kind of a similar thing to what Socrates was doing by showing that sophist wisdom wasn't really worth the price they were paying for it. Both of these guys, and this is an interesting one, in the Apology, we see the affidavit on Socrates that he's an evildoer, he's corrupting the youth, he's making the worse appear the better cause, stuff like that. And so we have, this notion that Charlie was clearly, kind of like Socrates, appealing to young people in large numbers. He taught them to embrace the deeper realities, what philosophers like me call the metaphysical realities, and to do noble actions, to be men, as he put it, that benefit society. One of the arguments he makes in Crito, this is like Socrates has been condemned to die. He's been put under house arrest. He's got a guard there who's not really fully present. He's sort of there and not there. Crito shows up, and Crito is one of his disciples, you might say, and Crito's trying to talk him into running away, and Socrates is trying to teach his young lad that he can't run away. He ought not to run away. And his reasoning was fascinating. The reasoning is basically that the state and the process of the state has run its course, and they have found me guilty, and they have sentenced me to die. And the state, Socrates has a very high view of our civic responsibilities to the state. And it's not just an American thing or an Athenian thing, but it's anybody who is reaping the benefits of their home country. And the state is now asking something of Socrates. It's asking for his life. And he says, Crito, what kind of philosopher would I be defending the veracity and the rights of the state, she's been like my mother. And she's like all of our mothers. She gives us everything we need to live, defends us from our enemies, picks up our garbage and our trash. She does so much for her, and now she's asking me for something. She's asking me for my life. What should I do, Crito, but give it to her? So it's a super high view of the state. Charlie likewise believed in patriotism in the state. And he saw the importance of the flag in the classroom. He saw the importance of remembering the American Revolution, the Civil War, the many speeches and historic moments that have made America great. He advocated for the center of that being marriage and having children, and that was the bedrock foundation for a civil and flourishing society. Socrates was a married man as well. Socrates understood the importance of the state and the importance of being a man, a principled man, who does what the state requires of him, pays his taxes, obeys the police, because the state is what holds these things together. Now, as a Christian, he understood God's behind all of that, but he understood the Bible also said, give Caesar what's Caesar's, to be obedient to the state. And that was in continuity with Socrates' argument. Both were charged with leading the youth astray. I've mentioned that one already, but Socrates, by questioning authority and inspiring irreverence, really. Charlie, leading the youth astray by helping them to embrace freedom, to love values, to believe that their country could be made great again. Both gave open, rational discourse a chance by platforming it in everything they did. And it's only when we have that kind of openness that we can actually make progress on the difficult questions. We have to talk to one another. We have to create forums where we have dialogue with one another. Sometimes that gets heated. Sometimes people come with anger, and then, that of course wells up within you, and he has to give a forceful argument in reply. But that's all part of open rational discourse, embracing the moment, embracing the conversation, and the great conversation must go on. Both Socrates and Charlie understood that. Both understood, and this is found, in the Apology, and it's also found in many of Charlie's speeches. Both thought or understood that wisdom resided in God alone. I mean, Socrates in the Apology expresses the story about having sent his disciples to the Oracle of Delphi, asking the oracle, who's the wisest person around, so that Socrates could go question them and learn from them. And basically, the oracle says, well, Socrates is the wisest person around. Socrates is mystified by this. He says, how could it be that I'm the wisest person around when I know that I'm ignorant? And of course, there's these great dialogues in the Apology about Socrates saying, well, maybe I'm better off than most people because they're ignorant, but they don't know that they're ignorant. I at least know that I'm ignorant. So those are some of the famous sort of self-realizations of Socrates. But then he says, but we all know God alone is wise. And of course, Charlie pointed to God and God's word, the Bible. There and there alone do we find the bedrock of wisdom. Even in Proverbs, it uses wisdom as another name for God. And so we have this continuity between the Apology of Plato talking about Socrates and God alone is wise, and Charlie Kirk pointing to the Bible, saying that God and God's word alone is wise. both people really loved other people, and they thought that the best way to help them was to help shake them out of their dogmatic positions. For Socrates, that was the question. For Charlie, that was the question as well. Charlie had something that Socrates didn't have. He had the authority and the profundity of biblical wisdom. So he not only used questions, but he was able to give constructive arguments, because it wasn't Charlie that they rested on. They rested on the authority of God's word. And he was empowered in that way to make these very strong arguments. And honestly, it's the events of this past week that show just how powerful Charlie's arguments were, because they got deep into the subconscious of millions of people. I suppose by now my audience has probably seen the millions of people marching throughout Europe, the vigils all over North America in honor of Charlie. And that isn't because Charlie was Jesus Christ. Charlie was merely really effective at sharing something that everybody knows is true. And that is that God exists and God has spoken, and he has been made incarnate in the person and work of Jesus Christ. And he kept driving that point home, and he kept demonstrating its superiority to every other worldview that's being offered in these universities. I don't know how many times you probably, like me, I would encourage you to watch some of his reels and some of these interactions, because eventually you can't help but realize that these university students are being scammed. They don't have any wisdom. They don't have any position. Now, if they were worthy opponents, that'd be one thing. It's like, okay, well, they're being taught something fairly potent, but they got nothing. I mean, that's what's really astounding out of many of those reels. It's like, who's educating these knuckleheads? Charlie would just show them, kind of like Socrates did, that they have fifth grade wisdom, or maybe a fifth grader would be even more wise than they are. Both Socrates and Charlie held that death is not to be feared. Socrates held this position because nobody had come back from the grave. And so he thought there's a great veil that separated us from whatever is coming in the afterlife, if there is an afterlife. He says, whether there is or whether there isn't, I ought not to fear, thinks Socrates, because if I'm pursuing virtue, I have every reason to believe that I will be able to continue pursuing virtue in the life to come. But if there's nothing after my death, then what am I fearing it for? It's gone. It'll be over. That's a little bit different, well, maybe a lot different than why Charlie thought death ought not to be feared. For all good things work together for those who know Jesus Christ. And that whether he lives or whether he dies, it's kind of like Paul, to die is gain. But he'll go on living in order that people might believe in him. And so Socrates believes on intellectual grounds that death ought not to be feared, for the reasons I've mentioned, but Charlie believed on biblical grounds, and his faith gave him great strength. Well, that phone call with Charlie made me realize that Charlie wasn't just a Socratic gadfly, that could make people recognize their ignorance and, stump the libs, whatever, but he was actually envisioning something more like Aristotle's Lyceum, a place where dialectical debates, virtue and ethics, the pursuit of human flourishing, what the Greeks called eudaimonia, could be once again pursued. All of those things were a little bit more Aristotle than Plato. And by that I mean Plato was all about mathematics, the forms, ideals, and so forth that were kind of a entry into the academy. You had to sort of understand these things as a gateway. The Lyceum was much more interested in eternal principles as they could be applied in science, in politics, in ethics, in civic life, and so forth, and engage and make real difference in the life of every citizen. When I think of how Charlie relates to these great Greek philosophers, I think of that Raphael painting of Athens, where you have Plato pointing upward in the center of the painting, and Aristotle has his hand pointing downward. Charlie Kirk points us to heaven, just like Plato did there. But he challenges us to make an empirical, historical, social, cultural, political difference. That is, to apply those eternal principles of truth, beauty, and goodness to the actual world, using God and God's word as a rich sort of foundation for doing that. And so he wanted to focus on biblical wisdom. He wanted to focus on the rich intellectual history of the West and the simple beauty of the founding documents of our country to make that difference in all of these spaces throughout culture and society. No analogy is perfect. When I think of Socrates, he died when he was 70 years old. He'd lived a full life. He gave his life toward the end because the state required of it, and it exampled the kind of virtue that he was trying to teach his disciples. Charlie didn't have that kind of agency in his death. It was taken from him. And yet he understood the risks. He understood that staking claims and open rational discourse might shed light into dark places that would strike back. I know there were threats on his life, and yet he kept moving forward. Socrates wasn't a Christian. How could he be? Christ wasn't born for more than 300 years later. Charlie is a Christian, and yet they have a kind of kindred affinity that I've tried to spell out here in some detail for you. Socrates was primarily a gadfly. There are sort of constructive arguments in Socrates and implications in Socrates that are very sort of foundational in Western thought. But there's sometimes we can't decide, because Plato is using Socrates as his spokesperson, it's often hard to sort of separate the visions of those two. But Charlie had a constructive Christian, kind of patriotic vision that was the sort of primary driving force for him. These similarities really, I think, helped to establish exactly what Charlie wanted to establish, and that was the saving of Western civilization. And he believed it started, and I think one of the reasons why, that this program prep year, is one of his final initiatives, that it all starts with a basic education in the Bible, in the Western intellectual tradition, and in the founding documents of our nation. You understand those things, then the other pathways in life can be gone down because you understand who you are, and you understand why we live in the greatest country the world has ever known. Well, that's it for today. I wanted to connect the dots, if you will, between what we're studying here and Socrates and Greek thought are kind of on the plate right now, but I couldn't help but continue the momentum of remembering Charlie Kirk. Obviously, he had a big impact on me, a big impact on what we're doing here, and I just pray that that his legacy will continue to live on, and that we would have a kind of intellectual and spiritual, emotional renaissance in this country, back towards things that are true, beautiful, and good. Well, that's it for now. Thank you for joining me. It's been quite a roller coaster ride here, and I appreciate your thoughts and your prayers. And until next time, I'm going to say goodbye now from the Firestone Files. Take care.
Thanks for stopping by to spend some time with me here on the Firestone Files. I hope today's reflections offered you some new insights and perspective on life. If you enjoyed the episode or found it valuable, I'd appreciate it if you'd take a moment to like, subscribe, and share it with someone you care about. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. What resonated with you? What challenged you? Or what would you like to hear more about in future episodes? Drop a comment below or send in your suggestions to the email in the description. Your input helps shape where we go next. This has been Dr. Chris Firestone. Until next time, keep asking the big questions. And remember, the kingdom journey is always best with your friends. Further up and further in. Bye for now.